The elevator doors haven't opened yet. You're standing alone inside, somewhere high above Manhattan. Fluorescent lights gleaming off the mirrored walls. Your own reflection looking back in a Navy power suit. The silence before the bell rings outside is thick, almost padded, like the hush before a show begins. You glance at your tie, straighten your posture, rehearse your smile, not because you need to, but because it's what you always do. There's something strange about that moment. It's only a few seconds long, yet it stretches in your memory like a hallway that keeps unfolding. You don't know it yet, but that moment, polished, practiced, and alone, will come to define an entire lifetime. Have you ever felt like you're always on? Like you know how to win affection, how to hold a room, how to impress just enough, but deep down, you wonder if anyone actually sees the version of you that isn't performing. Have you ever tried to love only to realize you weren't sure what that meant beyond being liked? You don't have to answer. Just listen and let another lifetime speak for you. This is Sleep Through Lifetimes. Each night, we let the current of time carry us, while the mind drifts lightly across the surface of memory. Whether you're already comfortable or still finishing something, that's perfectly fine. No need to analyze or focus. Just let everything unfold as it is. Where and at what time are you listening from? Drop a line below. Perhaps someone far away is journeying with you right now. Before we set off, I don't need likes or subscribes. I only hope that if you drift off midway, your sleep will be calm and your heart as light as a leaf. All right, let's allow the road ahead to tell the rest. You were born in a small New Jersey suburb, just a few miles from the city skyline, close enough to see the towers blink at night, but far enough that everything else stayed quiet. Your parents weren't unkind, but they were always busy. The kind of busy that made the house feel like a hallway. Things passed through, but rarely stayed. Your father worked in insurance, always suited, always composed. He taught you without words that silence could mean stability. Your mother kept a careful schedule. Dance class, dentist, frozen dinners lined up for the week. She praised your grades, but rarely held you. Affection was a reward you earned, never something freely given. You learned early that if you made people smile, they stayed longer. So you did. You smiled wide when the neighbor gave you a compliment. You said, "Thank you," just the right way. You weren't loud, but you knew how to say things that made people lean in. You never cried much. Not because you didn't feel, but because you understood, even as a child, that feelings weren't always welcome. So you tucked them away, folded behind politeness, like a napkin hiding a half-eaten meal. School reinforced it. Teachers praised you for being so well spoken. Other kids followed you around, sensing some ease you hadn't yet named. You were popular enough, but never the center. You didn't want to lead. You just wanted to belong, without ever having to risk being too real. By 12, you'd already mastered the art of mirroring. If someone joked, you laughed. If they vented, you listened, maybe with a clever comment to lighten the mood. You knew how to make others feel seen. But the funny thing about mirrors is, they rarely show themselves. You watched your older cousin come back from college in a red Camaro, telling stories about Wall Street and big money and drinks with clients. You barely understood what any of it meant, but it sounded like winning. And more than anything, you wanted to be someone others looked at and said, "No, that's someone who made it." Your teenage years passed like a resume being written. Debating club, prom committee, the right kind of friends, the right kind of shoes, and underneath it all, a subtle, growing emptiness. You couldn't name it then, just a faint ache, like something important got left behind in a pocket you no longer checked. But you kept going, because no one questioned you. You looked the part. You said the right things. You were never too much, never too little, just polished. And in a world where everyone was trying to be noticed, you learned the quiet power of being agreeable. And so when the acceptance letter from NYU came, you smiled for the camera and posed with the envelope. You hugged your parents. You posted the photo. But deep down, you weren't excited. You were relieved. Relieved that you were still on track, still likable, still not giving anyone a reason to doubt you. No one taught you that a life built on charm can sometimes go numb. That when you become too good at showing what people want to see, you start forgetting what you feel when no one's looking. Still, what else could you do? You were praised for being composed, rewarded for being smooth, validated for being easy to admire. And so you stepped forward, ready to trade your true self for applause. One smile at a time. College was your rehearsal for the real thing. At NYU, you slid in like you'd always belonged there. You chose business, of course. What else was there? Finance classes felt like theater scripts. You didn't have to love the material. You just had to perform it well. And you did. The answers came quickly, not because they stirred your soul, but because you knew what professors wanted. There was something intoxicating about it all. The clean lines of the suits, the early internship offers, the way people at networking events would scan your name tag, then tilt their heads when you spoke. You became fluent in small talk, adept in just the right level of banter. You weren't just likable. You were memorable. But in dorm rooms after parties, something quieter pressed at your ribs. You watched friends fall in love, fight, cry, break up, reconcile. You couldn't understand why it all seemed so loud, so raw, so inconvenient. Why would anyone choose that kind of mess? You went on a few dates. You even tried to open up once. But the moment someone leaned too close emotionally, you felt your chest tighten, not with fear, but with confusion. You smiled, said something kind, and quietly pulled away. You never ghosted. That would have been rude. You just faded, like the closing credits on a movie that never fully began. By your third year, you'd learned that being charming was easier than being close. A good impression required less energy than honesty. You could turn it on and off like a switch, and people rarely noticed the difference. If someone complimented your eyes, you'd thank them. If someone said you had a good heart, you'd laugh gently and change the subject. You told yourself you just hadn't met the right person yet. That you were focused on your future. That real connection could come later. Maybe once your name was printed on a business card from somewhere that mattered. One professor called you magnetic. Another said you had executive presence. You smiled and filed those words away like trophies, unaware of the quiet tax they would one day collect. The internship that changed everything was with a mid-size firm on 54th Street. Brick facade, buzzing phones, coffee that always smelled slightly burnt. You were the youngest in the room, but no one seemed to notice. You wore the suit well. You listened. You offered solutions that felt smarter than your age. By the end of summer, they offered you a spot to return full time after graduation. You said yes, of course. It was what you were meant to do. The day you signed the contract, you treated yourself to a dinner alone at a dimly lit steakhouse. The server asked if you were celebrating. You said something like that. When he walked away, you stared into your glass of wine and tried to feel something, anything. Pride, joy, even fear. Instead, you felt practiced, like an actor who knew the scene but not the meaning behind the lines. Still, you had a job, a future, a place where charm had currency. That was enough, wasn't it? You didn't know then that the price of always being impressive is never feeling truly known. But it would start to show soon. Not loudly, not dramatically, just in the soft, familiar way loneliness creeps in, quiet as a necktie being loosened in the dark. Your first day at the firm felt like walking into a movie you'd watched 1,000 times. Phones ringing off cue, shoes clicking on polished floors, the constant hum of ambition vibrating just beneath the surface of every handshake. You adjusted your cufflinks in the elevator's mirrored panel. Your smile, on point, your hair, sharp, your voice, calm, confident, just a hint amused. They liked you immediately. You learned quickly. In this world, competence was expected, but charisma was the real currency. You cracked jokes, just risky enough to be remembered, but never risky enough to offend. You memorized birthdays, knew how each partner took their coffee, and never once failed to follow up with a thank you. Email sent at precisely the right time. The office adored you. Clients trusted you. And in the background, You kept climbing, subtly, surely, without ever giving anyone a reason to say no. At lunch meetings, people leaned in when you spoke. You knew how to make them feel seen, admired, even special. You'd mastered the subtle nod, the brief laugh at the right moment, the self-deprecating story that made you seem real, but not too vulnerable. And for a while, it worked. It really worked. You started making money fast. Bonuses landed like applause. You moved into a sleek apartment in Midtown, floor to ceiling windows, 2 espresso cups, one always unused. You dated sometimes, mostly people from the industry. Conversations filled with subtle power plays. Who knew which partner, which hedge fund, which wine? You wore your charm like armor, polished, impenetrable, and oddly tiring. But here's the thing, no one tells you about being admired. It's a performance that demands encores. There were nights when you'd come home from an event, drop your keys on the counter, loosen your tie, and stare at the lights of the Chrysler building through your window. Everything was shimmering. Everything looked like success. But inside, there was no audience left to clap, no script left to follow. And then you met her. It was during a quarterly client mixer. You were doing your usual thing, smiling, light touch banter, keeping the room afloat, when she interrupted, not rudely, just unexpectedly. She said, "You must be exhausted." You blinked. "Sorry." She smiled, but not like the others, not like the ones who wanted something. It was softer, sadder. "I mean, keeping everyone happy all the time," she said. "That's gotta be a lot." You laughed it off, a little too quickly, changed the subject, moved on to someone else. But the moment followed you home, lingered, echoed. It was the first time someone saw you, not as a personality, but as a person. After that, you started noticing things. How you answered, "I'm good," before even thinking. How no one actually knew how you felt, because you didn't know either. How even when someone tried to love you, you didn't know where to put it. You weren't cold, just unpracticed. You'd trained your whole life to be likable. But love, that was a language you never bothered to learn, because no one ever told you you'd need it. Instead, you kept cashing in charm like it was enough, and maybe it was, for a while. But charm can't hold your hand at night. It can't ask if you're okay and mean it. It can't sit with you in silence and still make you feel seen. You didn't know it then, but your climb had a ceiling, not on paper, not in pay, but in connection. And the view from the top, it was stunning. It was quiet. It was cold. You told yourself it was a phase. Everyone hits a wall. Everyone feels a little empty sometimes. It didn't mean anything, right? So you doubled down. Deals became your drug of choice. The high of a well-timed pitch, the thrill of winning a client over, those were your fixes. You loved the chase, the strategy, the game. The moment they said, "Yes," your pulse jumped. Not from greed, from mastery, from knowing you'd read the room right, said the perfect thing, at the perfect time. But it never lasted. The rush would fade by dinner. You'd celebrate alone or with colleagues who all talked the same way. Numbers, mergers, strategies, gossip. Everyone looked impressive. Everyone laughed too loud. Everyone seemed just a little tired underneath it all. You went out more, not less. The parties helped you forget, until they didn't. The more you won, the less it meant. You started keeping a bottle of whiskey in your desk drawer, not for coping, you said, but for the aesthetic. No one questioned it. You were still charming. At some point, people stopped asking how you were. They just assumed you were fine. You had the life everyone envied. The apartment, the view, the job, the clothes. Even your voicemail was perfectly worded. But inside, your days began to blur. There was no excitement, no joy, just motion, just momentum. And one day, while looking out your office window, you realized something terrifying. You didn't remember the last time someone touched you without expecting something in return. It wasn't anyone's fault. You hadn't let them. You were generous with attention, quick with compliments. You could make anyone feel like they were the only person in the room, but let someone do the same to you. You'd joke, deflect, shrug it off, because letting someone truly in meant surrender, vulnerability, unmasking the carefully curated version of you that had kept you safe all these years. It wasn't that you didn't want love. It was that you didn't know how to stay still long enough to receive it. And besides, wasn't charm supposed to get you everything? It got you noticed. It got you hired. It got you clients, applause, invitations. But the people you couldn't charm, those were the ones you secretly longed for. The ones who saw through it. The ones who didn't flinch when your smile faltered. The ones who made silence feel like a language instead of a void. You remembered her again. The one who asked if you were exhausted. She had drifted out of your life. Not because of a fight, but because you gave her nowhere to stay. You'd flirted, yes. You'd met for coffee once or twice. But every time the conversation turned real, you pivoted. You made her laugh instead of letting her see. She wasn't dazzled. She wasn't interested in your suit or your status. And that, more than anything, made you retreat. Because if someone loved you for something you didn't control, who would you become when they left? So you stuck with the safe stuff, the flings that stayed surface, the friends who didn't ask too many questions, the coworkers who thought you were the fun one. You became indispensable to everyone, but intimate with no one. And the truth, you were lonely in a room full of people who liked you. That's the trick about impressing others. The more you succeed, the more they expect. The more you give, the less they see when something's missing. No one asked what your real laugh sounded like. Not even you. Because you forgot. You never meant to build a mask. It just happened, layer by layer, year by year. You didn't lie. You didn't pretend. You just became really, really good at being who everyone wanted you to be. Until one evening, you caught yourself watching a couple on the train. She was reading something. He was leaning his head on her shoulder, eyes closed, completely at ease. Neither of them spoke. No performance, no charm, just being. You looked away too fast, like you'd seen something private, something you didn't think you were allowed to want. Back home, you dropped your briefcase and walked into the bathroom. The lights were too bright. The mirror showed everything, not just age. There wasn't much of that yet, but emptiness in the eyes. You adjusted your tie even though there was no one around to see you. That's when it started, not a crisis, just a crack. You'd sit across from someone, at work, at dinner, on a date, and feel this small, hollow space between what you said and what you meant. You kept talking. You kept smiling. But there was a pause inside you, a beat too long, where real emotion wanted to live, but didn't know how. At first, you blamed stress, the market, fatigue. But then it happened during moments that used to bring pleasure. A joke falling flat. A compliment that didn't feel earned. A kiss that tasted like absence. You tried reconnecting with old friends. Reaching out to a college buddy. Having a conversation that didn't involve metrics or momentum. But you didn't know where to start. You weren't sure what stories were yours anymore, and which were just polished echoes you'd rehearsed for so long they lost their roots. The worst part, no one suspected. You still performed well. You still looked great. You still laughed at the right times. But the version of you that could truly receive love, real, messy, inconvenient love, felt as distant as a language you used to speak but hadn't heard aloud in years. And then she returned. The same woman from the client mixer, now transferred to a new department in your building. You passed her in the lobby. She smiled, slow and familiar. This time, you didn't pivot. You asked her how she'd been. She told you, briefly, honestly, asked about you, and for once, without thinking, you said, "I don't really know." She blinked, not surprised, not uncomfortable, just present. Later that week, you found yourselves walking the city after a long day. No drinks, no flirtation, just stories, real ones. She told you about her mother's illness. You told her about a recurring dream you had as a kid. Getting lost in a theater backstage, looking for a script that didn't exist. She said, "That makes sense." You wanted to ask why, but the wind stole the moment. You laughed instead, reflex. And she said, gently, "You do that a lot." What? Laugh when you're about to say something important. You didn't answer, but you remembered that moment for a long time. The night ended without a kiss. No promises. No declarations. Just something soft and rare: connection. But here's the thing. Connection, when you're not used to it, can feel like exposure, like standing under bright lights when all you've ever known are curated shadows. So, of course, you pulled away again. Not obviously, just enough. You let days pass before you texted. You responded with pleasantries. You left messages half written. You knew she noticed. You knew she deserved more. But your body didn't know how to stay, because staying meant being seen. And being seen meant risking the truth, that under all your charm, you weren't sure who you were without applause. You thought love was earned by performance. You didn't know that love waits quietly for someone willing to stop performing. She didn't chase you, and that's what made it worse. You kept expecting a follow-up message, a curious glance, a second chance, but none came. She had offered presence, not pursuit, and when you turned away, she let you. At first, it irritated you. You told yourself she must not have cared much after all, that you'd dodged something complicated, that you had work to do, deals to close, goals to meet, dinners to attend. But in the quiet moments, over black coffee at sunrise, or while folding shirts in your empty apartment, you felt it. That ache. The kind you don't tell anyone about. The kind that doesn't scream. It just waits. Like a letter unopened. She had seen through you, and it hadn't scared her. That should have been your sign. Instead, you buried it. You leaned further into your role. You became indispensable at work, the youngest senior associate the firm had ever promoted. Your picture hung on a wall no one really looked at. You spoke at conferences, mentored interns, posed for press releases. You were rewarded with admiration. You smiled in photos with people you barely remembered. You knew all the right things to say, but fewer and fewer people who actually heard them. And then, one afternoon in the elevator, you saw her again, not in person. In memory, a stranger had stepped in beside you. Similar hair, a similar stillness. You glanced over, startled by how much you wanted to say something. Anything. But the stranger got off 3 floors down, never looked your way. You rode the rest of the way in silence, heart pounding like you were being followed by yourself. That night, you pulled out an old folder from a bottom drawer. It was mostly clutter. Receipts, holiday cards, a movie ticket stub you couldn't remember keeping. But tucked in the back was a napkin, folded in half, ink faded. It was from the night you and she had coffee. You had written a joke on it. Something about how espresso was stronger than most of your past relationships. She had laughed. Really laughed. You stared at it like it might unlock something. A door you had locked years ago, and forgotten where you hid the key. The next day, you tried to find her. Quietly. No announcements, just curiosity. But she wasn't with the company anymore. moved to Chicago, someone said. That night, you stood by your window again. Same skyline, same glass. But something had shifted. You realized you missed her. Not in the romantic sense, but in the way a person misses being known, being interrupted, being called out gently, and invited back to themselves. You wondered what she saw when she looked at you. Not the resume, not the pitch, just you. And more hauntingly, you wondered if that version still existed. Charm had bought you so much, but it had also cost you something harder to name. Your capacity for stillness, your instinct to stay, your muscle memory for honesty. You began to notice how often people said, "You always seem so put together," and how little that sentence felt like a compliment anymore. It meant no one saw you wobble. No one saw you soften. No one saw you, because you never let them. And now, after all the bonuses, all the parties, all the carefully timed jokes, you were alone. Not because no one cared, but because you'd made it impossible for them to know how. It wasn't a single moment that changed you. No cinematic breakdown, no dramatic confession. Just small, accumulating fractures. Quiet moments where the performance slipped, and you realized no one was there to see behind the curtain anyway. You still smiled, still closed deals, still kept your shoes shined and your tie tight. But more often now, you caught yourself wondering what for. There was a dinner, not long after, with an old client turned acquaintance. A man you'd once admired, wealthy, eloquent, always surrounded by people. That night, though, he looked tired, really tired. After dessert, he leaned in and said, "Charm's a funny thing, isn't it? Gets you in every door, but doesn't help once you're inside." You nodded, not quite ready to agree, but not able to argue either. Because lately, charm had begun to feel like a second language you were tired of translating. It didn't make things easier anymore, just quieter, safer. You remembered a time you tried to be honest with someone on a date. Nothing heavy, just a comment about feeling disconnected sometimes. The moment you said it, you saw their expression shift. They smiled, said, "That's deep," and changed the subject. You laughed with them, played along, but inside you winced, not at them, at yourself. Because you knew the rules, you were the one who taught them. Be fun. Be clever. Be fascinating, but never be real for too long. Real gets awkward. Real needs patience. Real risks rejection. You'd spent your whole life avoiding that. And now, when someone offered you warmth, you didn't know how to hold it without dropping it. Even when someone showed interest, genuine, gentle, you questioned their intentions. Not because you didn't trust them, but because you couldn't imagine why someone would care for you when you weren't performing. You began pulling back from parties. You made more excuses to leave early. Your coworkers said you were refocusing, growing, probably meditating or something. They meant it kindly. No one pried. You started walking more. Aimless, late night strolls through the city, past lit windows where silhouettes laughed over dinners, past empty streets that felt more honest than any boardroom. Sometimes you imagined her living somewhere across the river, a soft apartment filled with books and teacups. Maybe she still remembered that napkin. Maybe not. But more often, you imagined yourself differently. Not richer. Not more successful. Just present. Noticing the wind without checking your watch. Asking someone how their day was. And actually waiting for the answer. You knew you couldn't go back and redo your choices. But maybe, just maybe, you could stop making the same ones. So you started trying in small ways. A conversation where you didn't steer. A compliment you gave without rehearsing it. A silence you let sit, even when it made your heart beat faster. And each time, it felt awkward, unnatural. Like speaking without an accent you'd worn your whole life. But inside that discomfort was something else. Relief. Because maybe, finally, you were done earning love. Maybe it was time to learn how to receive it. By the time you reached your late 30s, your name had weight in the industry. Recruiters sent gifts, not emails. Your opinions were quoted in financial journals. People introduced you at events like you were part of the brand, a fixture of the era, sleek, reliable, sharp, and still you felt like a visitor inside your own life. You worked efficiently, like a watch built for speed, but not for storytelling. No more spontaneous dinners, no lingering mornings. Even your vacations were optimized for appearances. Ski resorts, 5-star hotels, rooftop lounges with panoramic views, all curated like pages in a catalog. No one actually asked for. There were dating attempts, of course. Nice people, kind, funny, intelligent. You said all the right things, gave compliments, paid the check, walked them home. But when things started to move deeper, when connection threatened to bloom, you found subtle ways to distance yourself. You canceled plans late, sent safe, impersonal texts, focused on work just enough to claim exhaustion. Eventually, they drifted, and you let them. Each departure left no wreckage, just silence. Polite ends to polite beginnings. You didn't hurt anyone, but you didn't touch anyone either. And deep down, you started to worry that maybe no one had ever truly known you. You remembered a conversation in the firm's break room. Someone asked if you'd ever thought about kids, a family. You smiled, joked about training the next generation of investment bankers. But that night, lying awake with the city buzzing outside your window, you realized you didn't know how to imagine a life with someone. Not really, because to do that, you'd have to let them in. And not just into your apartment, but into your awkwardness, your quiet, your unpolished heart. And what if they didn't like it? What if the real you wasn't enough without the curated charm? That fear was louder than any market crash, more volatile than any client scandal, because no portfolio could protect you from it. No hedge could soften its fall. You remembered something she'd once said, back when you let her glimpse behind the mask. Impressing people is easy. Letting them love you is the brave part. At the time, you thought it was poetic. Now, you felt the weight of it. There was a colleague at work, quiet, thoughtful, always stayed late, but never asked for credit. You began watching how he spoke to his partner on the phone. The way his voice softened, the way he paused to listen. There was no performance in him, just presence. You wondered what it would feel like to be loved for nothing you'd achieved. No polish, no jokes, just for existing. The thought made your throat tighten in a way that surprised you. Because beneath all the accolades, the roles, the polish, there was still that kid in New Jersey, sitting in a quiet kitchen, learning early that being impressive made people stay longer. And now, as an adult, you were still doing it, still performing, still hoping someone might see through it and stay anyway. But the world doesn't work like that. People can't see what you never show them. And love needs truth to find its way in. It happened on a Thursday. The day had been long, meetings stacked, numbers stubborn, your body tense in ways you didn't notice anymore. You skipped lunch, skimmed your inbox, drank 3 coffees without tasting any of them. The sun had already dipped below the skyline when you stepped out for air. Just a few blocks to clear your head. The streets glowed orange under the lamps, and your breath felt heavier than usual, but you walked fast like always. Then, sharpness, a flash of heat across your chest, sudden and urgent. You stopped, pressed your hand to your ribs, waited, told yourself it was nothing, a pulled muscle, stress. But your legs shook, and for the first time in years, you were scared. Not of death, not really, but of dying without ever having been fully you. You didn't collapse. There was no ambulance. Just a long, trembling moment on a bench near Bryant Park, coat open, heart thudding like it wanted out. When it passed, you walked back slowly. The city moved around you, indifferent. The next morning, you showed up at work on time. As usual, hair neat, shirt crisp. You didn't mention the episode, because what would you say? I had a heart scare yesterday, and the only thing I could think was, I've wasted all my charm on people who never really saw me. No, that wasn't your style. Instead, you smiled, sat at your desk, wrote emails, took calls. But inside, a shift had begun. You started watching people differently, noticing how they spoke to each other when no one was watching, how they touched, even briefly, how they asked, "How are you?" and waited for the real answer. You envied that. You tried once to open up to a junior associate you respected. Told a story about your dad, something small, something true. They listened, and then they said, I never knew you thought about stuff like that. And you smiled, because neither did you. It was like dusting off an old instrument and realizing you still remembered a few notes. Not long after, you visited a bookstore during lunch, wandered the aisles aimlessly until a title caught your eye. The Art of Staying. You didn't know why you bought it, but you did. That night, you read it slowly. Each sentence felt like a whisper from a version of you that never got to grow up. A version who didn't have to earn affection, who believed they could be loved without proving themselves first. You thought again of her. Chicago, the smile that didn't ask anything from you. What would she think if she saw you now? Would she recognize this quieter version? Would she believe you were finally trying, not to impress, but to feel? You didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, you didn't reach for your phone to fill the silence. You just sat there, lights off, book in hand, and let the quiet arrive. Not as a threat, but as a guest. The postcard arrived in winter. You nearly missed it, tucked between bills and an alumni newsletter you never read. It was simple, pale blue, a faint skyline in the background. Chicago, it said in small block letters at the bottom. You turned it over. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, slanted, clean, a little rushed in the curves. I walked past a place that reminded me of you. Not the office, you, the quiet one underneath. Just wanted you to know I saw him once. He was enough. No return address. You stared at the card for a long time, fingers still, breath caught somewhere between regret and awe. She had known, even when you didn't. You sat down on the edge of your bed, the postcard resting in your lap, like a keepsake from a life you hadn't fully lived. And something in you shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, just softened. You didn't write back, couldn't, but you kept the postcard, tucked it between 2 pages of that book, The Art of Staying, as if it had always belonged there. In the weeks that followed, you began talking more during meetings. Not louder, just realer. You asked colleagues how they were and waited. You answered the same question with a truth that surprised even you. One afternoon, someone at work asked how you stayed so composed all the time. You paused, smiled, genuinely, not perfectly. I didn't. I just got really good at hiding. They laughed. You laughed too. But for the first time, it wasn't to deflect. It was to share. You visited your parents soon after, sat with them longer than usual, asked about things you never had time to ask, how they met, what they feared, what they gave up. You didn't blame them anymore. They had their own masks, their own polished surfaces. You forgave them quietly, not with words, but by letting go of the weight you used to carry on their behalf. At night, alone, you started writing again. Not for work, just fragments, half-thoughts, memories, feelings that had waited too long. Sometimes you cried. Not from pain, exactly, but from the strange release of being human again. Not perfect, not impressive, just present. You still had charm. It didn't vanish. It just stopped leading the way. Now, it followed, softened, smiled when it mattered, not when it was expected. People noticed. Some left, surprised by the change. But others arrived. One evening, a friend told you, "You seem more here." And you said, "I think I am." That night, you pulled the postcard out again. Read it once. Then closed your eyes and whispered, "Thank you," for seeing him. And in the quiet that followed, you didn't need applause. You just needed the silence to stay. You didn't retire in glory. No standing ovation. No farewell speech with a branded pen and catered cake. You simply stepped away. A few years after the postcard, you took a job consulting part-time. Smaller clients, fewer suits, more listening. You traded skyline views for quiet afternoons in a garden, level apartment with plants you actually remembered to water. People assumed you were taking it easy. Some said, "Good for you, getting out while you're still ahead." You nodded, smiled. But the truth was, you weren't escaping anything. You were arriving. The life you built afterward was simple. You started making breakfast at home. Toast with real butter. Coffee sipped slowly instead of gulped between meetings. You walked to the bookstore instead of scrolling online. Your phone rang less, and you answered more. One spring, you started writing letters. Not to send, just to say what had never been said. One was to her. You didn't write about regret. You wrote about becoming. You told her how you'd stopped running. How you no longer mistook attention for love. How her stillness had taught you more than 1,000 boardroom wins ever could. You folded the letter gently, slid it between the pages of that same book. Its spine now worn, corners softened like you. Your days blurred in quieter ways. The kind of blur that comes from peace, not pressure, from choosing, not reacting. Sometimes you still caught yourself trying to perform. When a neighbor complimented your patio garden, or when someone asked what you used to do back then, but now you noticed it, smiled at it, let it pass. One evening, sitting near the window with your tea, you heard someone in the building playing piano. The melody drifted up like something familiar, something unfinished. You closed your eyes, and there she was, not in flesh, in memory, in essence, in the version of you that finally stayed still long enough to be loved. And in that quiet room, where no one was watching and no one needed to be impressed, you whispered something, not to the past, not to her, not even to yourself, just out, soft as breath, honest as bone. Thank you. Our wind down begins below, outside. The city continued its rhythm. Soft car horns in the distance, a neighbor's laughter, the shuffle of someone walking their dog on the sidewalk below. You listened, not as noise, but as presence. Your body, older now, relaxed more easily than it ever did in youth. Your hands rested on the arms of the chair, like they had nowhere else to be. And for once, they didn't. The room glowed with the amber hush of late evening. Shadows stretched gently across the floor. The steam from your cup curled like ribbon into the air, disappearing into the silence. You didn't miss your old life, not even the shiny parts, because now you understood. Charm may open doors, but love waits for you to put the performance down. You might not remember any of this tomorrow, but the dream will go on.